Welcome and hello, everyone. Welcome to eTalks. In today's episode, we have a very special topic and a very special guest. Before we get into that, I want to first thank all of you for joining last week's relief campaign live stream. We hope that all the donation that has been raised and is still continuing, by the way, the donation you may still donate, that will go to all the earthquake victims in Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon. So thank you for that. I just wanted to open up with this. And for today, we have a very special guest. Our guest today is Professor Ikromov from the College of Business at CSU Sacramento, who has taught graduate and undergraduate courses in real estate finance and investments, business finance, and urban economics. Professor Ikromov's research interests include real estate market efficiency, housing, and experiential economics. He has a book, Affordable Housing Development, Financial Feasibility, Tax Increment, Financing, and Credits, which was published by Springer in 2019. And today's topic is very interesting. It's a topic that involves all of us, that interests all of us, which is why is housing so expensive? And today's moderator will be Said Hamid Hashmet from UC Berkeley. So I will give floor to Said and Professor Ikromov.
Thank you, Zainab. Welcome, Professor Nuriddin. Everyone here, especially the audience, has been dealing with this prevailing issue of expensive housing, mainly high rental costs. And unfortunately, we have heard different opinions about what or who caused it. Most common, for example, one party accusing another party of causing the problem, or a group of people accusing a single politician, which does not sound right to me. I feel like there are a lot of economic and policy factors that goes into this and it's behind this phenomenon. And good for us, we have you with us tonight to enlighten us on this topic, an expert in this field, and we're excited to hear what you say.
Thank you. Should I get started?
Yes, Professor.
Thank you, Said and Zainab. Thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be one of the speakers for this very exciting series of talks. The title, as you can see, rent is too damn high. This may be a little bit, old for some of the people in this group, but it's essentially inspired by James Macmillan, who was a candidate from the Rent is Too Damn High party for New York State governor's race in 2010. And so you can see these are some headlines from 2010. And he came into national prominence because his only issue as a candidate was that rents were too high. And so again, that's the inspiration for the title. And so today I want to talk about 6 things, time permitting, and I have a lot of slides. Probably won't be able to cover all of them, but I want to first, emphasize why housing is important. It's probably somewhat obvious to most people here. Second, what do we mean by housing affordability and unaffordability? And then look at some data. Is housing actually unaffordable? Okay, so or how unaffordable is it, and what are the trends? Okay, and next, what's so bad about expensive housing? If houses are expensive, is it necessarily a bad thing from the society's point of view? And then I'll talk about why housing is so expensive right now. And then, unfortunately, the last section, which is about what can be done, I'll offer some suggestions, but as we will see, I think throughout this talk, this is a very vexing, very complex problem. If it were an easy solution, I think it would have been solved by now. So unfortunately, some of the solutions I have here are going to be very difficult to actually implement in practice. Okay, so why is housing important? Housing is an essential need, just as food and clothing. Its shelter is an essential need, and it provides us with a home. It's not just a house; it's also a home. So it's somewhere we can feel safe. We can feel, with our family. Whenever things are going bad, outside of home, at work or at school, we know that we can always come home and feel comfortable and feel loved and supported by our family. If we go travel somewhere, there's a saying, home sweet home, right? So we always want to come home. Beyond that, it's housing is a major component of household wealth. In fact, most families in the United States, their only investment or retirement savings are actually consists of their home. They don't necessarily have other investments such as stocks or bonds, things like that. Housing also has an emotional attachment. It's a psychological thing. This idea of American dream, which is, we're supposed to work hard, we're supposed to succeed, and part of that is becoming a homeowner. And also, housing is a very large component of the economy or the GDP. So specifically, if we look at the GDP, housing represents about 18 to 20% of the GDP, depending on the year. So this chart shows here that you can see the blue line, housing, which is housing expenses plus utilities. That represents about 12% of the GDP by itself. And then also it's a big part of the consumption. And so here we have consumption categories that go into the GDP. The thick red line here is residential structures. So whenever we build new housing, that's considered it's considered investment into the future. So that you can see it's about 6% on average. So together that adds up to about 17% of the GDP. So it's a huge part of the GDP as well. Okay, so how do we define housing affordability or unaffordability? So essentially, it has to do with how much of our income is going to housing expenditures. And more of the income spent on housing means it's less affordable. So for renters, it's typically defined as rental expenditure divided by the monthly income. Typically, if it's more than 30%, meaning more than 30% of the rent, more than 30% of the income is going toward rent, that household is considered rent burdened. Sometimes people spend even more than half of their income on rent. In that case, we'd call that severely rent burden, right? So keep those ratios in mind in the next few slides. And then for homeowners, we can also think of affordability as, again, housing expenses, which could include the mortgage, property tax, property insurance, things like that, divided by the monthly income. And another measure of affordability for owners is the ratio of house price to annual income. Okay, so if you take your income and to take your house price, what is the ratio of those two? There's other affordability measures as well. For example, it's not just rent, but also transportation and things like that. So, but for the purpose of this, I think we can focus on income and then rent expenses. So, is housing actually unaffordable? Well, here's some anecdotal data. So this is from earlier this year, January 23rd. It says data shows that rent is still too damn high. Same headline, basically, which is showing that rents increased about 10% in the U.S. overall in the past year. New York City rents hit record January levels, right? So this is record high rent for New York City. So a bunch of headlines that suggesting that
Professor Nuriddin, can I ask a question from the previous slide, the one where many cities were one before that? So do we know why asking price for rent increased more in Seattle than, let's say, Austin, Texas? Is it because of population increase or housing shortage or let's say state policies? What's the reason?
So I don't have a specific answer for Seattle. I mean, I didn't look it up, but in general, I think you pointed to some common reasons. So which could be there's less construction, for example, in Seattle, or there could be increase in population. So perhaps if people are moving to Seattle from other areas. But I mean, specifically, I don't have an answer for that. But you can see Seattle seems to be kind of an outlier in this case.
Yeah, I see.
Okay. So a bunch of these charts are from a report that's called State of the Nation's Housing, which is published by the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University. And I have some data from 2018 as well as from this year, just to compare, what the trends have been. So here we have the difference in terms of incomes versus rent costs. So, for example, you can see the renters' median income, right? So average income has been pretty stable from 1960s to 2020s. However, the median rent or average rent is increasing steadily, right? So the incomes are not catching up with rents or keeping up with rents, which then means the yellow bar is the share with cost burdens, right? So people who are paying 30% or more of their income on rent, not surprisingly, has been increasing in this period. Okay. Likewise, in 2018, this is affordability of home ownership or housing, and the areas that are blue are relatively affordable, right? So this is the ratio of house price to the household income. Okay, so in these areas, which are kind of in the middle of the country, on average, house price is about 3 times family's income. But you can see along the coasts, mostly along the coast, we have more orange/red areas where average house price is 8 times or more of average income, right? So that's, again, measure of unaffordability in terms of ownership. Okay, so in terms of the demand side, right? So the demand side is going to be mostly due to household formation, how many households are forming, which then will need housing. So that hasn't really declined that much during the pandemic. So demand has been pretty strong. Okay, and so the result is we can see both house prices and apartment rents really increased in the last year. So this is going from 21 to 22. So you can see this is year-over-year increase. Okay, home prices about 20% increase in the last year, and then apartment rents more than 10% increase in the last year. So this is just in 1 year, right? It's a really substantial. And then you can see in the previous couple of years, it's not as extreme, but still, positive increases in both rents and prices. Okay. And in fact, house price appreciation actually set a new record in the last year, okay, in terms of percentage increase. So you can see here, both in nominal prices and rent prices, these are year-to-year changes. The previous high was in the mid-2000s, and then we had a housing crisis. So leading up to that, we had upwards of 15% increase in house prices, but this past year, it's actually exceeded even that. Right. So in terms of home ownership, that's the unaffordability side.
Professor, can I ask a question from the previous slide? What happened 2014? What explains that increase in housing?
2014?
Yeah.
Here?
That's also not normal. Yeah.
So you can see the trend here. So we had a build up in house price increases. They increased very significantly in from 2000 to 2006, and we had the peak and the housing market crashed, right? So you can see actually it went negative for a number of years, then so after that trough until around 2012, really house price kept declining. Okay, and in this period from 2008 to around 2012, people's demand kind of kept building up, right? As we'll see in a few minutes, there wasn't a lot of actually very little construction in that period, right? So very little construction, and then more families forming, right? So young people are coming up, getting married, forming families, and so the demand kept building up, and then there was a big increase, in 2013, 14, and so on. But then afterwards, it's been pretty stable, and then we have a huge peak in recent couple of years as well.
I see. Thank you.
And yeah, so I think a lot of this big increase is because prices were decreasing here, so developers, home builders, didn't really have an incentive to build new houses. So there was very little houses, very few housing units were built during this period.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. So this is another chart that kind of combines the two things that we looked at, which is rents for both apartments and single-family homes has surged in the last couple of years. So again, you can see more than 10% increase in both cases. But here we can see that it's this increase in rents is not uniform across the country, right? So Some parts of the country, again, you can see kind of the middle part of the country, the rents are increasing, but not significantly. But again, along the coast, we can see they're increasing 10%, and in some areas up to 20% or more, right? So the increases are not, concentrated in one area. Okay. And it's not surprising that cost burden is actually different based on income levels. So lower income households are much more cost burdened than high income households. Okay, and so let me skip a couple of these here. And then the last thing I want to mention here is that we had a spike in interest rates recently in the last year or so. And that itself actually increased to increase housing costs by more than $600 for an average priced home. Okay, so house prices not increasing, people's income are not increasing just because interest rates are higher. Now people have to pay higher, cost in terms of mortgages. Okay. So I'm going to skip that. So I think we've established, that housing is becoming much more expensive, both in terms of rent and ownership. So is it actually bad to have expensive housing? Well, let's look at two sides. If house prices are increasing and rents are increasing, there are actually some winners in this scenario. Okay, and so specifically here we see that in the past year, in 2020 to 2021, homeowners actually gained so much, equity because house prices increased. And you can see again, equity is just the increase in the value of the house versus the mortgage that they might own. And so if typically mortgage balance is going down, and then if house prices are increasing, your equity is also increasing. So due to these increases in that last year, again, you can see the coastal areas, where I am, California, Arizona, Washington State here, 90,000 and over, right? So an average household gained more than $90,000 in home equity in just 1 year because house prices are going up. And then smaller equity gains in the middle of the country. So if you're a homeowner, right, in this period, it's actually really good for you. Why? Because your equity is going up. And even better if you're a landlord, if you own a bunch of properties, their values are going up and your rents are increasing. So you're a winner in that scenario. But everybody else, renters and people who are trying to buy a house would be losers, right? So that's what I mean by winners and losers. But I think it's more important to look at the society or the overall economy in general for the entire country, as opposed to who are the winners versus losers. Okay, so there's a bunch of problems associated with lack of affordable housing, and rents being too high or house prices being too high. Some of which include overcrowding, overpayment for housing, congestion in terms of traffic congestion, environmental costs, which come again with traffic as well, infrastructure costs, adverse health effects, right? So if, especially people are commuting hour and a half each way every day, right? So that's going to have not only, a cost in terms of commuting itself, but also medical, issues and psychological issues and so on. So that shouldn't be overlooked either. But here I want to focus on last two items here, which are productivity and employment and lower income mobility. So what I mean by productivity and employment is, so let me read this quote. This is a quote by a book by Di Pasquale and Wheaton. So I'll just read it, the whole thing. It's kind of long, but I think it's an important point, which is a metropolitan area stock of real estate structures, together with its ability to develop land, is an important resource. Without affordable housing for the area's workers and buildings for its firms, output cannot be produced. The capacity of a region to readily expand its supply of real estate is a crucial ingredient for ensuring continued economic growth. Okay, so without this capacity, real estate rents will rise, right? Eventually increasing both the wages that must be paid to labor and the prices that must be charged for output. such increases in the cost of local production can eventually choke off economic expansion and stifle long-term growth. So in California, we are actually seeing some indication of this already happening, right? So a lot of people you've probably seen stories in the media that a lot of people are leaving California because housing is so expensive. And so then firms also are having difficulty, hiring workers, and that makes the economy of our state, for example, less competitive. Okay. And the other one that I want to focus on, which is the income mobility, is based on this paper by Raj Chetty and his co-authors. So what they looked at is they tried to find areas where children who are in the lower income levels, right? So they're born, in other words, to low-income parents. Where are the places where they can actually move up, right? So their income mobility, meaning can poor children do well and move up into the higher income categories. And so the way to look at this chart is the lighter areas are where income mobility is the highest. Okay, so in other words, children who grow up in these areas have a higher chance of improving their situation in life. And so where are the light areas? Well, a lot of them are in California and also kind of in the middle of the country. And then a lot of the low mobility areas are in the south, southeast. But so if you look at kind of large metropolitan area, you can see, for example, one of the highest is actually San Jose. So if you're a child who's born into poverty and you grow up in San Jose, you have a much higher chance of moving into higher income levels in the future. But this is a problem. Why? Because housing is so unaffordable in San Jose, and people cannot move to San Jose and similar areas because housing is so expensive. So that's a big problem from the overall social point of view. Okay. All right. So quickly, why is housing so expensive? Okay. So I offer a few reasons. First is, I think, pretty understandable, which is new units are actually much larger and higher in quality than in the past. So every year, basically, the average house size that's built is getting bigger, and with technology, with developments in the industry and construction technology, the quality is also getting better. So if the house is bigger and it's of better quality, it makes sense that it should be more expensive. But beyond that, we're having huge issues with labor costs as well as material costs of construction materials. Okay. Another reason is that there hasn't really been a lot of improvement in productivity in the construction industry. So that is something that is needed very, very soon, I think. Also, there's scarcity of developed and ready-to-build land in the most desirable areas of the country. And then I want to focus on two major factors which are somewhat unique to the United States, I would say, which are zoning and other land use regulations, particularly in some regions and metro areas. And if I went back to this affordability chart, you can, just by looking at this chart, I think you can guess where those regions are. So basically along the coast, right? So left, East Coast, West Coast, that's where it is much, much more difficult to build new housing. And so that is related to the local regulations. And then what we call NIMBYism, or not in my backyard attitude to new housing. Okay, so some examples of better quality over time. So this is housing that was built in the 60s and 70s. This is newer housing, right? So you can see much higher quality. The costs of building materials I mentioned, huge increases. 40%, 35% increase in plastic construction, gypsum, 20%, lumber, 20%, right? So none of that is going to be helpful to reduce the construction costs, right? Very, very large increase in construction costs. I don't have a chart for labor. Yes.
what is the reason for the increase in capital cost? Is it
So
the
I think
shortage of capital?
especially, so this has been going on for not just, because of the pandemic, but it's been going on for at least 10 years. When I talk to people in the industry, they say, our costs are going up, around 7-8%, like every year, right? So that's way higher
Mm-hmm.
than inflation. And then,
I
of
see.
course, we had the pandemic as well, and that exacerbated the problem because there were supply chain issues in every industry, which also increased the cost of construction.
Okay.
Um,
And
you know,
is this
for lumber
increase adjusted?
specifically, there was a period during the Trump administration which
Mm,
raised tariffs for Canadian lumber, right? So they increased the taxes for importing Canadian lumber significantly. So that raised the lumber costs as well, for a period. Okay.
okay. Okay.
And then in terms of other factors that are contributing to high house prices, low housing supply, right? So low housing supply because of high construction material costs, high labor costs, as well as local regulations, as I mentioned. So you can see here, this is the supply of homes on the market, which is at an all-time low right now. So houses for sale, currently are at the all-time low. And so, and when you have higher demand but supply is so limited, then the inevitable result is that prices will go up. Okay, and as I mentioned, the demand is not decreasing; it's increasing. So, roughly speaking, we can do kind of back of the envelope calculation. If the population is increasing about 0.6%, let's say, so that's about 2 million people. And
Mm,
the average household size is actually a little less than 2.5 right now. So that translates to about 1 million new units that are needed every year, right? And so
mhm.
if we're not building as much housing to meet that demand, then of course prices are going to keep going up as well. Okay, so are we building enough units? Well, there's some good news. Okay, so there's some good news, which is actually, before I get to that, you can see here, this chart shows the increase in demand for apartments, right? So the red line is demand for apartments. And then the yellow line is the new completions. So new apartment buildings that are being built. So you can see very little change in new construction, but the demand is going up. So that leads to rent increases, as we saw. Okay, I'm going to skip this part, which is about California specifically, which is essentially showing here roughly California needs about it needs anywhere from 180,000 to 350,000, depending on estimates. So the midpoint would be about 200,000 new housing units every year, and that has been the average from 1954 to 1990. But from 2009 to 2018, less than 80,000. Right, so that's
Mhm.
like 30% of the new housing that is needed is actually being built, and this is for like 10 years, right? So the shortage is actually getting built up on top of the shortage from last year, from previous year, and so on. And so this
Yeah.
shortage in California is particularly dire, even compared to other parts of the country. And so I mentioned there's some good news, which is here we have new construction of housing of new construction of new housing. Red is single family and yellow is multifamily. So both are increasing; they're an upward trend. But notice again, in 2006, very little construction for a number of years, right? So almost no construction
Yeah.
in single family for many years until around, again, like 2014 or so. So we're kind of on the right trend, but when you look at this period for about 7 to 8 years, there was very little construction, and so we have a lot of catching up to do in terms of new housing. Okay.
I see.
Okay, and so the last thing I want to mention, again, this is kind of unique to the United States, and especially in certain parts of the United States, which is not in my backyard attitude. Okay, and so if places like California, especially, need a lot of housing, there's a shortage. What is the solution? Well, we should build more. Right. So here is an article by Mark Andreessen, who is a very wealthy and very prominent venture capitalist. He's one of the I think that he's the CEO of a venture capital firm, Andreessen Horowitz. And he said he wrote an article. It's time to build. Right. So it's time to build new housing in California. Okay. And he turns out lives in actually the wealthiest zip code in the United States. Does anybody know what's the wealthiest zip code in the United States? It's very close to you, Said. It's Atherton, California. Okay. So it's in the Bay Area, Atherton, California. So he lives there, and Atherton, California recently had a plan to add some new multifamily housing apartments, right? And so here is Mr. Andreessen's response. And so this is from an article called "The Billionaires' Dilemma." Okay, it's so after this project was proposed, he wrote a letter to the city. It says here, immediately, capital letters, immensely against multifamily development. I'm writing this letter to communicate our immense objection to the creation of multifamily overlay zones in Atherton. Please immediately remove capital letters, all multifamily. This will massively decrease our home values, the quality of life and of ourselves and our neighbors, and immensely increases the noise pollution and traffic. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, increase in house prices is makes the current homeowners winners, right? So the problem is people who are especially living in relatively wealthy areas think that new housing, especially multifamily housing, will reduce their property values. And they're, dead set against new construction, especially multifamily, right? And so the regulations in the United States are mostly at the local level. So local residents actually have a lot of say in blocking new construction, just like in this example. And so even though it might actually be a great idea for overall region or the state or the country to build more, a lot more housing, it may be against the interest of individuals, like in this example, and they will be very, very vocally opposed to it. They will show up to meetings. They will, express their, opposition to it, and often they end up blocking new construction. And so what can be done? Again, I'm going to stop here. I think I'm almost out of time. So some potential solutions, which none of them I think are easy, but first of all, improve incomes, right? So if people's incomes are higher than given rent levels, housing will become more affordable. So how do we raise incomes? Well, that's, it's probably a separate conversation.
Another topic.
Don't raise the housing costs unnecessarily, right? So a lot of those types of regulations that I mentioned add to the cost of construction, add to the cost of development. And some of them make sense, as we saw actually in the aftermath of the earthquake in Turkey. There are many building codes, safety codes, which are there for a reason, right? And in Turkey, they were actually in place, right? So there were building codes that you're supposed to, construct a building according to those building codes, but people were cutting corners to save costs, right? And we saw what happened. So a lot of those are there for a reason, but in some cases it could be somewhat excessive, depending on the specific situation. Another reason for higher costs in general is market power by players, by firms. In other words, lack of competition. The housing industry or construction industry in the United States is fairly competitive, so we should keep that way. Keep it that way. We should keep it, competitive. And then, in my opinion, I think something that would be very effective is to change those zoning rules and building regulations from more local level to perhaps state or even federal level. But again, that's very, very difficult. In the California, legislature especially, there have been a number of attempts to change legislation from local to state level, such that the cities like Atherton, for example, would be required to build more housing, but it's very difficult to pass that kind of legislation in the current environment, at least. And then there is probably more funds that should be spent on rental assistance, for example, especially for low-income households. But again, that's a political question, right? So depending on who's in Congress, depending on how many votes each party has, sometimes that changes. But in general, it's also kind of hard to increase subsidies both for renters as well as for increased construction. And so, unfortunately, like I said, these are potential solutions, or some of the potential solutions, but none of them are actually easy to implement in practice, which is why we have this persistent unaffordability issue in housing. So I'll stop there in the interest of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nuriddin. And now we're going to move to audience questions. And there are interesting questions raised by them. Sorry?
Should I stop sharing?
Yeah, it's fine. So there's one question that says, is there something we can do as a community for affordable housing?
Yes, I think one of the silver linings is that I mentioned that planning and land use regulation is mostly done at local level, right? So that's where individuals can actually have a lot of influence, right? If they always say, like we, for example, voters in California, we don't really have a say in the presidential election, right? So the Democratic candidate is always going to win California. So our votes almost don't count, right? But at local level, it does, right? Especially if you live in a smaller community, you can organize, right? You can show up to meetings. You can express support for affordable housing, for multifamily housing. And by the way, there isn't actually very strong evidence that new apartments reduce property values, right? In a lot of cases, I think people are opposed to new multifamily development because they don't want riffraff to be close to them, right? I mean, it's kind of a coded word, but it's not just because of property values that people are worried about it. It's just that they don't want certain types of people, moving into their neighborhoods. So in that sense, I think individuals or small groups even can have some influence by trying to lobby their city councils, planning departments, and so on.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Another question, very interesting. It says, will our taxes also increase? I'm not sure if it was related to slides.
Can you say that again?
Will our taxes also increase? This is just a question.
So I think it's related to the last point I made, which is part of the solution might be to subsidize or fund rental subsidies, for example, provide rental subsidies. So, for example, in the United States right now, there are programs which help low-income households, especially, to pay 1/3 of their income, right? So, low-income households that qualify, they only pay 30% of their income, and this program pays the difference, right? Regardless of the rent levels. But there just isn't enough money to fund that program. So, for example, if somebody qualifies, signs up for it, they might have to wait 3-4 years to actually get the funding. So, if Congress funds more, Congress provides more funding for that program, that would certainly be helpful. And so it's just I think again it's a political choice, right? I mean, Congress has X amount of dollars that are coming from taxpayer money, and where they spend it is a political issue. So somebody might say, well, why am my tax dollars helping somebody else to pay rent, right? So somebody who is lower income to pay rent. Well, the answer to that, or part of the answer to that, is actually we do subsidize home ownership a lot more right now, which is through the mortgage interest tax deduction. So if I have a mortgage, which I do, and pay interest on that, that interest is actually tax deductible, right? Up to a certain amount. But renters don't get this subsidy. So this subsidy is worth something like close to $70 billion every year. Okay, but the rental assistance to low-income households, the one that I mentioned, is just a small fraction of that. So in fact, we're actually subsidizing homeownership a lot more than renters. And so who are the homeowners? Well, people who are relatively high income. And so what we're doing is we're taking taxpayer money and we're subsidizing relatively higher income folks, and then we're providing less subsidy to relatively low income folks, which are renters, right? And so again, it's a political choice that we have made as a society, but there's no reason why we can't change that. For example, shift some of that subsidy from mortgage interest deduction to rental assistance, for example.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then just one more on that is I didn't show the chart here, but one of the most effective ways of spending some of that money might be actually to prevent evictions. So evictions are a huge problem because if somebody gets evicted, then it basically starts a chain reaction where their credit is ruined, right? So then they can't find new housing, then may not be able to find new work, and then in extreme cases they might become homeless. So when they become homeless, then it's really difficult now to come back into being a renter or forget about homeownership, right? And so a little bit of money in many cases can actually prevent somebody from getting evicted. In some cases, it could be just like 1 month rent or utility payment, right? And so some of the most effective way of if we want to kind of maximize the benefit from the taxpayer money might be to prevent evictions. And the chart that I didn't show was showing that evictions actually decreased during the pandemic because there was a program to help people with their rent during the pandemic, but now it's going up again. So that's a potentially big problem as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor, for the answer. Due to time constraint, we have to move to the special questions, although we have more questions left. So yeah, the first one, what are your 3 favorite books that you would like to recommend to the audience?
Okay. So my favorite book is probably Animal Farm by George Orwell, which I think has actually become more like really, really relevant right now, where a lot of the countries are actually moving from liberal or kind of democratic systems to more authoritarian type systems. And so that book is, I think, a really great like cautionary tale about that. It's really about the Soviet Union going. It's really about the Stalin's period. Anyway, so I would highly recommend that. Related to my own field, I really like Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He is a Nobel Prize winning. He's a psychologist, but he won the Nobel Prize in economics. So the book is about how the brain works in terms of quick, intuitive decision making versus more elaborate, kind of calculated processes. So that's a really good book. And then as a child, I think my favorite book was Little Prince by Antoine Saint-Exupéry. Antoine Saint. It's kind of hard to pronounce me for it's a French name, but Little Prince is another book that I've always liked.
All right, thank you. And the next questions, what are your 3 favorite movies that you would like to recommend to the audience?
Oh, 3 favorite. I think my favorite movie is Dr. Strangelove. It's a kind of a dark comedy about arms race and nuclear weapons, of importance of preventing nuclear war. and it's also about game theory. So I really like that. Another one would be Pulp Fiction. I think I like Pulp Fiction a lot. Most Quentin Tarantino movies, I think I like a lot.
Yeah.
And then the third one probably have to be some kind of comedy. I'm gonna go with the Life of Brian, which is by Monty Python.
I see. Life of Brian. All right, thank you, Jam. The last and most important questions. What is your favorite color and what are your thoughts on art?
I'm a very boring person, so my favorite color is blue, I guess. And in terms of art, I guess I'm also a Philistine. So I think Philistine is somebody who's not very sophisticated in terms of art, but even though I probably don't know as much about art as I should, I really do enjoy going to museums. Like I think my favorite is my favorite is the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. But I also really enjoyed visiting the Art Institute of Chicago. It has a lot of really nice paintings. But then I think you are at Berkeley, but near you there's Stanford has a bunch of open air museums, which I really like as well, like the Rodin Sculpture Garden and all of that. I like that they've made it available to the public for free. And I think in general, what I would say about art and museums is that they tend to be very exclusive, and very wealthy people tend to enjoy them. And a lot of the art is actually in private collections as well, and where I would prefer them to be in museums and accessible to the public as well. So I like that the Stanford Museum is also free to the public, which is a very nice museum as well.
All right, thank you, Professor. Thanks for being here, and I'm sure this is not the last time we will host you, and we will hopefully have other episodes on talking about other related topics, other important topics of housing, real estate, and also business. Thank you so much.
I'd love to. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, thank you, Professor. I think it was a very informative topic. I've sent it to especially to, my parents and whoever is right now, dealing with these kind of issues. And also, one interesting thing that you have said is that you like Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is one of my favorite museums. And, with art being more accessible, I think many people will benefit from it as well. So that was a very, very interesting point. Thank you, Hamid, for moderating today's eTalks episode. Thank you so much. And thank you, Professor, for accepting our invitation and giving us a beautiful presentation today.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for you and your team for all your efforts to bring these talks to the public. That's it's not an easy thing to do, and I know it requires a lot of organization. So thank you. Thank you.
We appreciate it, Professor. Thank you so much. And I want to thank our audience today for joining us on eTalks' episode. And please feel free to subscribe and like and comment down below. What are your thoughts? What are your struggles about housing? And let us know in the comments. And see you next week in eTalks.